As Kim said, I'm Vice President of the Princeton Battlefield Society, and I want to start out by thanking the Princeton Public Library and the National Trust for Historic Preservation for supporting this lecture featuring new revelations on the Battle of Princeton. I should mention also that in 2012, the National Trust declared the Princeton Battlefield, specifically the location of the winning counterattack, as one of the 11 most endangered sites in the United States. The Battle of Princeton was a seminal moment in history and a critical turning point of the American Revolution. Without a doubt, this battle saved the American Revolution. Without success at Princeton and the success of Trenton over the Hessians, the American Revolution was destined to sputter to a stop. The Battle of Princeton gave General Washington and the Continental Army credibility. For the first time, we defeated professional British soldiers. Funds that had dried up began to flow into the Continental Congress. Soldiers re-enlisted. The militia in New Jersey became emboldened and began to aggressively harass the British. Farmers and townspeople became less cooperative in allowing the British access to food and supplies. Within a year's time, the British had largely been chased out of New Jersey, and the French had begun to take us seriously, leading to their eventual collaboration and the successful end to the American Revolution with the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Our presenters tonight are historic archaeologist Wade Catts and historian Dr. Robert Selig, who were the authors of a major 2010 study on the Battle of Princeton financed by the American Battlefield Protection Program of the U.S. Department of the Interior. Their work is documented in a volume with a big name, Battle of Princeton Mapping Project, Report of Military Terrain Analysis and Battle Narrative, Princeton, New Jersey. There is a link to the study on our website, the PrincetonBattlefieldSociety.com, and note that it's a .com and not a .org for reasons I don't really understand, but that's the way it is. This study developed a new interpretation of the sequence of the Battle of Princeton using the Geographic Information System and the Global Positioning System, referred to as GIS and GPS, to map the physical evidence in 175 original accounts, 150 continental and 25 from Crown forces. Dr. Selig and Mr. Catts will be discussing not only the findings of this study, but also subsequent revelations and questions that still remain. Before setting the stage, I want to talk just briefly about the original documents that were the basis for the study. There were a wide variety of original documents, letters, diaries, even the records of a court-martial, the court-martial of Cornet Henry Abbott of the British 16th Regiment of Light Dragoons. But most important were the pension applications, many of which were written long after the battle as a congressional requirement to receiving a pension for service in the American Revolution. These pension applications contain a great deal of information, but also include inaccuracies, both because of poor memory and exaggeration, or just plain falsehoods by people who did not serve in the American Revolution, but were looking for pension money if they could get it. Often they were written by someone else who was listening to the applicant, and to modernize, they are very difficult to read. Looking at just one example, here we have the pension report of a soldier named Jebez Flint, who is believed to be at the Battle of Princeton. According to what is known of Mr. Flint, he was born in 1756 in Hampton, Connecticut, and according to some records, he served in the American Revolution for 3 years from 76 to 79. And having reviewed his pension report, that seems to be borne out in the pension report, but I have to tell you that the information is very convoluted and complex, and it's very hard to really map out his entire service. After his service, he moved from Connecticut to Dutchess County, New York, where he was a teacher and a justice of the peace, dying and being buried there in 1844 at the age of 88. The application, which was sworn to in court, was written in 1832, long after the American Revolution. Now, looking at some details of this particular application, there is no reference to Princeton or Trenton in the application, although Mr. Flint does refer to the Battle of Monmouth and Valley Forge. The application says that, quote, he discharged the duty of quartermaster on the line of march during the Battle of Monmouth, having charge of the baggage. It also says, we remained till the cold season commenced when we removed with the army to Valley Forge. The sufferings of the army there are well known. So you can see some of the difficulties and complexities for the historian in combing through original sources with scattered details that do not always confirm other information, but are just another piece of the puzzle. Now to set the stage, you're all familiar with the two battles of Trenton, and then Washington's daring exit from the clutches of General Cornwallis and his march to Princeton on the night of January 2 and the morning of January 3, 1777. Many of you have seen the Cadwalader Spy Map, which is dated December 31st, 1776, the week before. Washington used this map to guide his entry into Princeton and the formation of multiple flanks as he prepared for a battle. Here you have Quaker Road along the bottom there. You have the college in the middle, and if you look in the middle, you see a little tiny cap house and the word college. Over on the left is Bainbridge, and you see some notifications of military activity in Nassau Street, and you can see some cannon at the bottom there of Nassau Street, and it says 9-pounders. You can also see some entrenchments. And according to the comments on the map, the entrenchments are just being completed in construction. So this is what Washington had before arriving in Princeton. This was his pair of eyes. This map doesn't show the Friends Meeting House or the Thomas Clark House, which I find very odd, which creates some interesting questions about who really drew this map and how remarkable it was that Washington followed it, knowing or not knowing so many things that he really needed to know. Now I want to briefly introduce the speakers. Dr. Robert Selig was the historian for the Princeton Battlefield Study. He obtained his PhD in history from the University of Würzburg in Germany, 1988. He's an expert on the American Revolutionary War and was project historian for the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail, the W3R Trail, which goes through Connecticut, New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And he's published numerous books and articles. Wade Catts is Associate Director of Cultural Resources with John Milner Associates. He has a master's degree in American history from the University of Delaware, which he also obtained in 1988, must have been a big year, and is a registered professional archaeologist with 30 years of experience in historical archaeology and historical research, and he was the project manager for the Princeton Battlefield Study. He coordinated the GIS and was responsible for the military maneuvers analysis, which is called CACOA, and I'm sure that he's going to explain to you what that means. In 2011, he presented a paper on the Battle of Princeton at the conference in Paris. He's worked at the Valley Forge National Historic Park, as well as other military parks, as well as Camp Security, a British POW camp, and American Revolution sites in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware. I give you Wade Catts.
Thank you, Kip. Is there a way to turn those down? Okay, that's fine. And then I'll switch images. I appreciate you all coming this evening. This just as kind of a preamble to what I'll talk about a little bit. This is the map that, as Kip indicated, is the map that Washington has to work with. And in our modern society, where we all have handheld GPS units, and you can look at it a phone and it tells you where it is you want to go. You have to put yourself back a couple hundred years and recognize that maps were not common. Not everybody had one. You don't have them in your wagon. You don't have them in your saddlebags. They're hard to come by. And Washington's map makers were some of not the very best at the beginning of the war. That's sort of a double negative. But they weren't some of the best that were around. Whereas the English had very good map makers. And the Hessian soldiers and the Germans also had good map makers. So having a quality map was a real problem. And this one, considering probably what that individual had to go through to get this map, this is fairly useful as a map to attack an outpost. Now I'm done. No, I'll go on to the next one. As Kip indicated, we had worked on a project. My co-authors on this are Dr. Selig and Matt Harris, who is also a registered professional archaeologist, and he actually did the GIS work and the GPS work, so his knowledge base is a lot stronger there than mine is, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that he did. What we're involved with here was an American Battlefield Protection Program grant, and so this is funded, the work that we did here was partly funded by the National Park Service. This is a really important statement that I think it's useful for you all to keep in mind as well, talking about battles and military actions. And it's by probably one of our premier military analysts from the Second World War, S.L.A. Marshall, that battles are inherently messy affairs. And so it's up to the historians, and I would add the archaeologists after the fact, to try to come back into these things and put some sense to what happened. You very often find that the first-person accounts vary depending on where that individual was on the battlefield at any given time, what they saw, what they didn't see, whether their unit was engaged, whether it wasn't. There's a whole range of issues that come into play, and so it's important to try to go back through all those documents and pull them together. The archaeological information, the terrain analysis, all of those things play into understanding a battlefield. And I'll put this up front as well, that we had a lot of people support us and help us in the work that we did here. Many of these are historians in their own right. We have a number of archaeologists, a number of academic historians. We have people from overseas who supplied us with some material. So there's a lot of people that were involved in helping us develop this interpretation, or the new interpretations, new kind of revelations that we've come up with. As part of an American Battlefield Protection Program grant, we were looking at a volume that had been put out in 2007 by the National Park Service, looking at Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites in the United States. Princeton Battlefield is considered to be a Class B site with high to short-term and medium long-term threats. So that was one of the reasons that the grant was granted by the National Park Service in the first place, or awarded in the first place. You all are familiar with what the battlefield looks like today and what is around it. It's a National Historic Landmark. It's considered to be one of the New Jersey top 10 endangered sites in 2009. The National Trust for Historic Preservation put it on their 11 most endangered in 2012. It has a broad range of resources that surround it. The park is there, but you also have other lands that are public access lands as well. Now, to talk a little bit about the American Revolution and where we are in the war, you need to also think about the American Revolution in its broader transoceanic context. And that basically is that it is one of the first conflicts between a colonial power and its colonists. That had not really occurred prior to the American Revolution. The second really important thing to note is that it's an opportunity, or it's one of the first times when it's the citizen soldiers who are doing the fighting. It's not a professional army. It's the development of a professional army for the Americans. It's a professional army on the part of the British and their Hessian allies, which I'll try to continue to refer to as Crown forces, but I might drop back into referring to them in some other way. But it's important to keep that in mind, that what you're talking about is an opportunity or a time when citizens under arms were important, and it's the beginning of the way our nation fields an army, which is something that hadn't really been figured out to at that point. So for the American forces, you're at the beginning of our military professionalization and the creation of a military tradition. As Kip had mentioned, and you probably all are familiar with this, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, the New Jersey campaign in the winter of 1776 had not gone well. The 10 crucial days, which are the period right around Christmas through New Year's, that was a real turning point for the Americans in particular, and also gave George Washington a level of credibility and kind of military acumen that no one had really credited him for up to that point. Throughout most of the fall, from August through the fall, there had been one American defeat after another. Crown forces were forcing the Americans back down towards the Delaware River, which is what you see on this image. The Americans had crossed back over the Delaware River. Philadelphia had been evacuated. Congress was gone. They basically said, you're on your own. Handle things yourself. Good luck. and things look pretty bad. But on the 26th of December, we have the First Battle of Trenton, which is an American victory on taking an outpost. The 2nd of January, there is again some engaging that is occurring right at Trenton, and then it's Washington stealing a march on the evening of the 2nd and 3rd of January to show up at another outpost position at Princeton. Bob may talk about this a little bit later, but I want to mention that if you look at this whole system of taking on outposts, Washington applies this on a number of occasions, and the first would probably be Dorchester Heights in Boston, where he attempts multiple columns to land or attack British forces, in that case, British forces. It never happens because the weather kicks up and he cancels the operation. The next one you see is Trenton, where if you really look at Trenton, it's not all of the multiple columns that make it to Trenton. It's only 2, I think, of his 4 or 5 multiple columns that get across the river and are able to force that attack. The next one is Princeton, and as Bob will talk about, we're looking at, again, a series of multiple columns trying to move around and surround the outpost at Princeton. The 4th time he tries to do it is at Germantown, where he has, again, multiple columns. This is November of 1777. Multiple columns, some of which make it, some of which don't, and it ends up in a defeat. So what you might be thinking about here, or keep in mind that in many cases, Washington seems to have had a view of his military prowess and his men's military prowess and his officers that was far above their abilities. They were not yet ready to do multiple attacks, multiple column attacks where you have to coordinate timing, etc., in order to make that work. Trenton, it worked. Princeton, it works, but it probably didn't work exactly the way he had it in mind to make it work. As I said, on the evening of the 2nd and 3rd of January, Washington is at Trenton and then steals a march up to Princeton. So he has a military force here under Lord Cornwallis, and Cornwallis is of the opinion that all I got to do is wait until the morning of the 3rd, and I can walk right in there and just walk right over the American forces. Cornwallis wakes up on the morning of the 3rd and is hearing gunfire from his rear, and Anyway. He realizes that he needs to get back to Princeton. At the same time, a brigade of the 4th British Brigade under Mahood begins the march from Princeton to reinforce Cornwallis at Trenton. Mahood looks to his left rear and sees a column which wasn't supposed to be there, and he sees this at dawn. At the same time, the American forces look to their left rear and also see a column which they didn't expect to see there. So that sets the stage for what we had at Princeton. And what I'll end up talking more about is what we did to get us the kind of information and the data, and Bob will talk a little bit more about what it was that we did about the battle and how it unfolds. But it's important to note that this is a meeting engagement. This is not a planned engagement in any way. Neither force intended to fight at the Clark Farms where they fought. If Washington had been able to do what he wanted, he intended to surround Princeton and bag the entire garrison, capture whatever he could of the garrison. As Kip mentioned, we used a lot of primary sources for this. Now, and this is important, secondary sources are great. They give you the background, the source, the overview of what it is you're after. They tell you where a lot of those primary sources are. But the primary sources here were letters, diaries, journals, officer records, and as Kip mentioned, the pension records. We probably compiled, I would think it's safe to say we compiled more first-person accounts than anybody else has pulled together on this particular battle at any time. We have over 150 or roughly 150 Continental Army militia references, sources. Some are pensions, some are letters. It varies in what their level of detail and quality is. We also have 25 Crown Forces records, and that is certainly the larger number that's been compiled than any other researcher has done. A couple of these are sources that have not come out of England and only had recently been seen coming out of England. So it's really very useful. In particular, the court-martial record of the 16th Light Dragoon Cornet, Henry Evatt, but also a couple of letters that deal with the death of Captain Leslie of the 17th Regiment of Foot. Leslie was related to a general in the British Army, and so his death, he is killed at Princeton. Leslie, the captain, is killed. That death you have to report it back to the family, and that therefore means you got to kind of explain what it was that happened. And so that issue is kind of an important one. And really, those letters provided some data, some real detailed information on the battlefield itself that we had not seen or hadn't been seen by anybody else. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you need to consider these 4 items: the who, what, where, and when of a battle. So, and particularly of the sources that you're looking at, and who that individual is. Are they an officer? Are they an enlisted man? What sort of document is this? Is it a pension? Is it a letter? Is it an official document? As Kip mentioned earlier, those pensions can be quite, they can be written down a long number of years after the individual was engaged in the battle. 1832 is a period when a lot of them begin to be written down, and the level of detail is important. But as she mentioned, Jebez Flint was 88 when he died. He was in his 70s, probably late 70s, when he applied for the pension. He's had a lot of hard living between the battle and that period of time. Some of what he may remember or not isn't necessarily correct. So that when the pensions were looked at, very often they were scrutinized. They were critically reviewed by a number of people, not just the individual submitting it, but you had other people who had to check it and make sure that they could verify what it was that individual said. Some I have seen actually where they get the sequence of battles wrong or what they did incorrect, and they're rejected. And I'm often wondering if this isn't a case of somebody it's such a long event ago, they don't remember exactly what order things occurred in. The guy probably could have gotten a pension, but it was rejected because he didn't put it in the right sequence of events. Where on the battlefield this individual is, and when it was recorded. So those are the kind of things that we had to keep in mind as we went through this. We also used battlefield images, and there are a number of these, including this, which is the Charles Willson Peale painting, another a Trumbull painting, and then some of the sketch work that went with the Trumbull painting. These are really important because the one on the lower left is the landscape from probably between the Clark House and the college. So that you can see that in the 1790s when this was done, there isn't a whole lot of trees. There's very little between you and the college. You could have seen the college from here. Charles Willson Peale was at the battle, and so this is somewhat of a painting from memory. Trumbull was not. Landscape and terrain, we walked the battlefield a number of times. In different periods of time, you'd be surprised at somewhat subtle terrain changes that are out there, so that if you're at one portion of the battlefield looking to another, you may not be able to see everything that's in between you. And so, but if you only have a map, a topographic map, and you're not on the ground itself to see that, it changes your viewpoint entirely. Being on the ground makes a big difference to be able to understand what happened. And then to be able to take that and put it back with those first-person accounts, it makes a big difference. We used a lot of the historic maps, and we pulled maps not only from the period as early as we could get up until the 20th century. And so you have things like the Cadwalader map here. We have the map that was first published on the battle, which is Wilkinson's map, published in 1816. We have a 20th century topo map, which is probably the first time that you begin to get topographic information shown on the battlefield. Up till that point, no one is showing you topographic survey information. We have the map from when the state park was being proposed and they wanted to indicate where it was. On all of these, what we've shown is what the state park property looks like and where it's shown, where it's illustrated. And we put all of these into a GIS system. This gives you an idea of the range of maps and sources that we tried to pull in. There are historic maps here. There were digital imaging that we did to get elevation models. We put in road traces. We put in ground cover and land use changes over time. First person or road paper returns, if you could find them. Archaeological records were put in, historical photographs. All of that went into the GIS in order to try to help us understand what we were doing here. When you do things like plot the Thomas Clark house property deed, which was dated 1772, you get this configuration for the Clark property. And what's important to note, and I'll talk a little bit about, is that the corner marker references, this reference says that there's a stone planted on the east side of Sawmill Road. I want you to keep that one in mind. We've talked a little bit about the spy map already, and some of the problems you run into is when you plot the parkland onto it and have to digitize and georectify this, it has a tendency to distort the map. That map isn't one that you can necessarily put into a GIS. You can get a sense of it, but it won't go in very accurately. Same thing with the Wilkinson map of 1816. You can see how that changes and distorts slightly. And the Cincerbo map of 1944 is a little bit better because it was done more accurately. The map maker was more accurate. We also used aerial images, and I find this one really interesting because it's 1945, so you see Princeton at a time before much of those areas and fields have been developed. They have houses on them now. The Clark House and the park is the area that you see here, and this field, the Mercer Oak is here, the Colonnade is over here. As I mentioned, we did viewshed analysis, and this was something that Matt Harris had worked on for us. And essentially what this helped us with was to try to understand where on the battlefield you could be at any given point and what you could see and what you couldn't. And an example of this is if you were here, for example, if you're the British forces marching out of Princeton and you see American forces to your rear, visibility would be anything that's in red. You would be able to see this area, or you could see anything in yellow. But purple, you don't see. So from this high ground, you can't see down the valley, down Stony Brook Valley. Whereas for the Americans, visible to both would be red, and they can't see this, but they can see those areas. The other thing that Kip had mentioned was that we use GPS in plotting some things. And just to give you a sense, what I had mentioned was that we're looking for that stone by the road. You also have what we think is the possible location of where the sawmill was, which is out here. Or there is definitely a cellar hole of some sort, foundation hole that sits out there. It's likely to be the sawmill given its location. Nobody's ever done any research on it. It was pretty far beyond the scope of work that we were being asked to do to see if we could actually find the road that leads to this. But every one of these red lines that you see out here is a potential road trace. And so there are lots of smaller roads and roads that run through that area. But this is the thing that I felt was pretty significant, and I've looked at a lot of these over time. This is a stone, and in that deed record it says there's a stone planted on the east side of Sawmill Road. That stone is still there. That is not a natural field stone. That is a corner marker stone. And if you look, Matt here is standing on the old road bed of the trolley line that ran out there through the woods, but it runs more or less east-west. Now, if that was the original road that the Americans used, that was either the Sawmill Road or back road, whichever term you want to use for it, if that was the road, then you can't have a stone on the east side of an east-west running road. It's not possible to do. But if you turn and look north, this road trace is still there, and the Clark House is here. This could very well be, and we are interpreting it as, a portion of that back road that Washington advanced on, because that stone is on the east side of this road. Now, we have a sense that this is the general location of that road. We don't know its entire location, but we believe that that's the right location. There is no road paper for that road that we have been able to find. There's no good definition or distinction about where that road is located, but that's our sense of where it is. And if you place that with some of the other first-person accounts, the first-person accounts begin to make sense in a way that they didn't make sense previously. I mentioned that the first-person accounts that we have for several of these formations, and these are the regiments and the companies that comprised the British Army at the time of this battle under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,000, 1,500 British soldiers here. The 17th Regiment of Foot, the 40th Regiment of Foot, and the 55th Regiment of Foot are the principal regiments that are represented here. There is a small contingent of Royal Artillery. There's a unit of recruits and convalescents who are men that are basically on their way to join other formations in the Crown Forces Army. So they just happen to be along on this march to head there. They were not really, they're more or less an ad hoc formation. They are not, they'll fight, but they're not under officers that they recognize. They're kind of a mixed bag of people. You also have 2 companies of light dragoons, the 16th Light Dragoons, which you can see pictured here. This is the 17th Regiment of Foot. We know of, in some cases, some of the information that goes with them, and so if you will indulge me a moment, I'll just give you some sense of what those first-person accounts are. From one of the members of the 52nd Regiment of Foot, he says that, let me find where I was going to do it. General Washington had marched out of Trenton a few hours before we arrived. It was supposed to recross the river into Pennsylvania. We remained all night lying on our arms. Now, this officer, Martin Hunter, is actually with Cornwallis's forces, so he is not at Princeton, but he's reporting what he's hearing. In expectation that he would attack us if he had not recrossed the Delaware, but he certainly made a much better maneuver than either by marching during the night to Princeton and at daybreak attacking the 17th and 40th Regiments. In the morning, we were astonished to hear heavy fire of cannon and musketry. We supposed at Princeton on our rear and immediately marched back there, but before we could arrive, General Washington had completely defeated these 2 regiments and 200 grenadiers and light infantry that were on the march to join their battalions. Nearly the whole were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. I was quite shocked to find poor Captain Williamson was among the killed. He had received orders that the day I left New York to march the recovered men that were in hospital to join their regiments and arrived at Princeton just as the action began. Poor Williamson was a most accomplished young man and was the 3rd captain that the 52nd Grenadiers had killed since the commencement of the war. So the value in the first-person accounts is that you're not just getting that account of an official event. This man knew these people. There are individuals involved in these situations. This is one of the officers. The British officer corps is a very tight-knit group of people. They all know each other. So when you have an officer killed like that, it really has an effect on people. Another from Lieutenant William Armstrong of the 17th Regiment of Foot. You will forgive my dwelling so long on this subject, but I am not a little vain of it, nor would I on any consideration have been absent when the regiment was engaged. But my pleasure was not unmixed with pain. The distress I felt on the death of my much valued friend, Captain Leslie, who fell on the first fire, cast such a damp on my spirits that I was for some time insensible to every object around me. A more amiable young man never existed. Now that he and Sir Arthur Murray are gone, I have no particular intimates in the regiment, although I am happy to say that with everyone I am on the best footing. So these accounts, the first-person accounts really do provide a much deeper, more nuanced range of information. The other thing I would like to mention is that we know that the 16th Regiment, the Dragoon Regiment is here, and that first-person account from the court-martial record is very, very useful for this. And again, we have the Wilson Peel painting here, but in the far left corner of the Wilson Peel painting, you see his illustration of dragoons. Now, as Bob will talk about, the dragoons were on the right flank of the British forces and repeatedly indicate that they have to keep moving their position further and further and further to the right in order to prevent themselves from being outflanked. And the forces that are probably doing that outflanking are Brigadier General Mifflin's troops, and Bob will talk a little bit more about them. The American forces at Princeton were a very mixed bag. You have continental forces, you have volunteers, you have militia formations, and all of those are in a very high state of flux. They come from a variety of states. They're coming, the Continentals are from pretty much all of the states that were still had Continental troops in the American Army at that time. Militia formations were coming from New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Well, I'll draw your attention, because I am a Delawarean, by the way. So I would like to mention, this gentleman over here is from Rodney's Light Infantry from Dover, Delaware. Now, if you read Rodney's account, Thomas Rodney's account of the battle, Thomas Rodney will tell you that he is like the only Delawarean who was there. Now, first of all, there are about 6 other Delawareans from the 1st Delaware Regiment that were still there. But Rodney says, other than those guys, we're the only company that was there. Well, the work that Bob and I did was able to uncover that that's not probably the case. And I'll give you the pension record of a Newcastle County militiaman, Ensign George Nixon. And Nixon says, this deponent is old and frail, but well recollects the whole scene then displayed. And he's talking about the battle at Princeton. After renewing the fires about midnight, the American troops were silently withdrawn, and after gaining a position in the enemy's rear, were marched towards Princeton, near which place, early next morning, they met the rear of the British troops where a battle was fought and the latter defeated, in which this deponent bore his share to the best of his skills and understanding as ensign in said company, and he has now in his possession the very sword and spontoon by him carried on that occasion. This is 1833, and he's writing this from Ohio. So I would love to be able to find his sword and spontoon. They have to exist someplace. The other one that is important, I think, to note is one that Bob was able to pin down. Many of you have probably heard of Sergeant R before. There's an account, a first-person account. It was published in the 1880s in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. The man's name was never given. It was only given as Sergeant R. In the course of the research that we did here, Bob was able to find that man's pension. He is a Sergeant Root from Connecticut. And one of the things that he mentions in his pension is that about sunrise on the 3rd of January, 1777, reaching the summit of a hill near Princeton, we observed a light horseman looking towards us as we view an object when the sun shines directly in our faces. Bob will probably talk a little bit about that as we go on, but you need to keep that in mind, because if you think about how you look when the sun is shining directly in your face, you're shielding your eyes. And it makes a very, very big difference in the way the battle is interpreted and in which direction the American forces came. The American army that is fighting at Princeton is actually the third American army that has existed at this point. And this gives you a sense of how we're still trying to develop at this time that American military tradition. There's an army of observation that was created in 1775, and it's principally made up of the New England militias, and it's a short-term enlistment. We still had a very, very strong aversion to anybody who enlisted for more than a year, or 6 months, or 3 months would be better if you could do it that way. No one had a real sense for how long the war was going to last, and so in 1775, after those enlistments ran out, Washington finds that even though he's got the British penned in Boston, he has really, his army is kind of melting away right in front of him. And so he's recruiting a new army in 1776. That one is a continental army, but it also only has 1-year enlistments. So as the campaign of 1776 occurs, it's finally dawning on everybody from Congress through the Army that we need to have a much longer-term army, one that's essentially a professional, sophisticated army that can take on the Continentals, or can take on the Crown forces. And that by 1777, that is the third army, which is long-term enlistments, 3 years of the duration of the war. That third army isn't even the army that fought 10 days earlier at Trenton. And that's what you need to understand, is that this is an army in flux. The army that fought at Trenton, their enlistments were expiring, and the army's size was dwindling, but many of those regiments were still fairly good-sized regiments. By the time the 3rd of January rolls around, a large number of those formations have been amalgamated into 1 or 2 regiments. Some of the New England units are mixed units of 2 or 3 or 4 regiments just to form a unit. As I mentioned, the Delaware Continentals had over 200 men, something like 200 men, at Trenton. By the time they fight 10 days later at Princeton, there are only 6 of them. And that's not because they all died or got sick. It's because most of them left, went home to recruit. So that the commanding officer was there and a few other men, but not a lot of men. So what you're looking at is this army in a state of flux, and Washington has to work with this army in order to make this entire event occur. And when you think of it that way, this whole idea of breaking up into various columns, trying to surround an outpost, and doing this with formations that are kind of coming and going, and units that are in this kind of state of change all the time, is really, really remarkable that it worked, and kind of unusual that you would think that he would have even thought it could work. Now, one of the other sources of information we used was archaeological. And this is really important for doing battlefields, because battlefields are remarkably resilient places. If they haven't been bulldozed completely and the ground's completely destroyed, there are still elements, still pieces of those battles that are out there, the detritus, the debris, the leftover material that gets dropped behind. They are generally marked by metallic artifacts. You're not going to find domestic artifacts, ceramics and glass and things. You may have some of that, but in most cases, battlefields are marked by lead shot, cannonballs, buckles, buttons, the leftover pieces of a battle. Traditional archaeological methods, such as digging holes on a regular basis across the field, generally don't work. but metal detecting under supervision works really, really well. And so this is one of the things that we didn't do additional archaeology, but archaeological work had been done on the battlefield in a couple different locations. And so we used that information and drew on that to try to understand what happened on the battlefield. A number of studies have been done over the last 30 or so years, and that's the range of studies are listed here on the side. But what essentially happens here is that when you do the survey, back up for I'll just back up to the previous slide. Come on. Oh, well. No, I won't. Oh, yes, I will. When you're metal detecting the field, you are looking for those metal objects, like a button, for example, here. Once that's found, you're using a total station. You're basically mapping that item exactly where it was found. You bag it, you flag it, you tag it, you mark the spot where that came from. And when you do that, what you get is a pattern, something like what you see here, where every one of these points marks a place where artifacts have been found. Artifacts have been collected in the state park lands. Artifacts have been collected in the IAS lands adjacent to it. Those are the two areas principally that have had archaeological work done. Those state park lands have been looked at on a number of occasions by the organization here at the bottom of the slide, Bravo. They are a volunteer metal detection organization that comes in, and the state allows them to come in and do the metal detection. The artifacts are turned over to the state. The research on the adjacent property was undertaken by Hunter Research and then written up by Louis Berger Associates. This gives you an idea of the range of artifacts or the density of artifacts that have been found. The state park property is shown here. The IAS property is shown here, but you can get a sense of the range of materials that have been found, or their distribution anyway. And the types of artifacts that were recovered from portions of the battlefield include musket balls, which are dropped, fired, and extracted, and I have an image of one of those for you. Also buckshot and canister shot, so we have artillery. Bayonet fragment, a copper ramrod holder, the nose cap to a committee of safety musket, which is what you see here. Cartridge box finial that you see here. Iron butt cone here, which is for a staff or a spontoon. It's the iron point that goes on the bottom of one of them. And then a silver real. These are all objects that are not likely to be dropped by a farmer. These are more than likely related to the battle. The kinds of lead shot that have been found include musket, rifle, and buckshot. And in the lower corner, this is not material from Princeton, but they would be similar to this. So you have buckshot, which is the small end of this, and then up to larger shot. Those larger shot are associated generally with British Brown Bess muskets. The smaller buckshot is more than likely American, and the things in between are an indication of American as well as either muskets or rifles. And this is something that's important to keep in mind. You remember that we have an army that's in the state of flux. The extracted musket ball that I mentioned is this one, and the extractor is more than likely something like this. It has on the reverse side of it a hole in it that would be where you would have used the worm or this extractor tool to pull the musket ball out. The thing that's kind of poignant about that musket ball shows that it impacted something. It hit something. Now, there's no reason to extract a musket ball from a tree, but there is a reason to extract a musket ball from a person. And so this could be probably one of the most specific battle-related to an individual artifacts you can find. That musket ball hit something and then was later pulled out. And the tool that you see over here is probably one of those tools that was used to pull it out. I mentioned that we have a broad range of musket ball types that have been found, and this is in keeping with that military force that the Americans were fielding at the time. You see here a list of balls per pound and numbers of muskets. This is from Cadwallader's Philadelphia Associator battalions that he had with him. Balls per pound is basically the size of the ball and how many per pound of weight they can hold. The smaller the number, the larger the ball. The higher the number, the smaller the ball. That's the range of muskets that just in his battalions alone, that's the number of muskets that he had, that each one of them had a different size ball that they fired. That's a logistical nightmare. If you're the quartermaster, that's almost impossible to do. There are, 13 or 12 different weapon sizes there that he has to deal with. The other one that I'll point to you, here's the return for the Marine company that was attached. The Pennsylvania Marines had actually sent forces into the battle that were on foot. They weren't on ships anymore. It's hard to see this, but in this lower corner it says, in order to bring yourself out to 36 rounds per man, I need X number of musket balls at an 18 and X number at 20. Cadwalader doesn't even have any 18s, but he does have 20s. So you get the sense in just these two documents why the standardization of the American Army that had to occur, and it had not occurred yet at this point. What's interesting to look at is if you take those musket balls that are at Princeton, which is in purple, and look at what's found a year later at Monmouth, you're beginning to see that level of standardization. Those are French muskets coming into American hands. Those are a standardized 69 caliber musket. Up until that point, we weren't doing that. So you can look at Princeton and match it to a battle that occurs a year later and begin to see that change from kind of sort of the citizen army to the professionalization of an American army. Something else that we've identified on the battlefield is canister shot or grape shot. These are basically iron balls, and they are shown in this corner here. These are some that have been found. In analysis of these, they seem to be ranging mostly between 1 and 1.8 ounces in size. There is one that's a 3-ounce ball. Generally, then, what that means is we're looking at 6-pound guns, and the Americans and the British both had 6-pound guns. So it would be useful to be able to say, I can show you that this must be a target that's being fired at and this is a British gun firing, but we don't know that for sure because they're both using the same kind of ammunition. The 3-pound balls, however, the 3-pound guns are strictly American or Continental Army guns. So that ball, where that was found, is firing on a British target. So when you take all of that documentation together, the archaeological data, what you end up with is what amounts to sort of a swath of dropped, fired, spent musket balls, artillery, ramrod clips, the finial. All of those things seem to be in a belt that sort of exists along this side. Now, keep in mind, the site has never been fully systematically archaeologically surveyed. The state park property is in grass, as you all know, but it hasn't been plowed in probably 60 years. And so plowing of those fields would more than likely break up the thatch and make it a lot easier to get more data, archaeological data, which is almost certainly out there. These smaller areas that you see here are the locations of those that canister shot and where it's occurring. Canister shot, again, is, if you think about it in terms of farmers dropping objects, they don't carry cannons. They don't have canister shot. That's definitely battlefield-related material. You're not going to find those out there unless it's a battle. So when you have all of that kind of information, and Bob will talk more about this, this seems to be our best sequence at the counterattack period of time, what's going on. The British forces are on the high ground that sort of fronts where they're I've lost my name of where I'm trying to be, but it's basically looking towards the Clark House across that field. American forces are coming in on a variety of directions. And I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Bob. And then we'll probably come back for questions if you have any. Okay? Thank you.